whiskey lovers, and welcome to another one of Mark's Whiskey Ramblings. Today I would like to talk to you about this Speyside Distillery. Now the Speyside Distillery is actually a distillery built on the southern border of the Speyside, but I have to be honest, when you build your Speyside Distillery in the Speyside, why call it Speyside Distillery? That's either pompous or, well, best case scenario, very confusing. But it's a bit of a weird story because in 1962, George Christie is the guy who ordered the building of this distillery, and he built it by hand. And that's why it took until 1987, 25 years before his distillery, his Speyside Distillery, was finished. It took another 3 years before the very first spirit came off the stills. So in 1990, we saw the first spirit from the Speyside Distillery. But what a ridiculous and mostly confusing name indeed. Now they mostly make a bulk whiskey for blends, for export to Asia and America. On the home market, they made a whole panoply of whiskies, not only Speyside single malt, but they also have whiskies named Beinn Dhu, Blackburn, Dubh, Drumguish, stuff like that, Glentromie, but also the Speyside single malt. It has not been on my radar very often because I find the Speyside Distillery whiskey rather meh. So in 2013, the distillery was taken over by Harvey's of Edinburgh. They took it over and they rebranded the whiskey, and they aptly named it simply Spey. So no more confusion. They now make the Spey single malt. And they've reviewed the wood management, which was very much needed. But I have to be honest, I'm still not a big fan of the Speyside Distillery whiskey or the Spey single malt, except for one, this one. This is the Spey Fumare. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. It's not Gaelic or anything. It's actually Latin, and Fumare means smoky. So we can imagine that this is going to be a smoky, a peaty whiskey. And that's a bit of an odd one out because, well, at Speyside Distillery, they only experimented with peated malt. So normally the Speyside Distillery whiskey, the single malt, is actually fruity and quite light. But they also experimented with some peaty barley, and that's what this is all about. This is, if not mistaken, the first and only official... Where did the sun go? This is the first and only official smoky whiskey from the Speyside Distillery, the Spey Fumare, and it is a limited edition, what's in the name, of 18,000 bottles. It's been cut down to a drinking strength of 46% ABV, and oh, I think we can lose this now. 46% ABV. Look at that color. It's such a light color. It's white wine basically in color. Well, let's find out if this is any good. The Spey Fumare at 46% on the nose. It's a very light nose. I get some white fruit, some apples and pears, some grapefruit in there, hazelnuts, a bit of marzipan, and all of that is wrapped in this very gently smoky blanket. There is also a sour note in there that's not much to my liking, but apart from that, all in all, this is actually a pleasant nose on the palate. It's mildly creamy, immediately very sweet on vanilla and some white fruit again, but then there's this huge smoke development indeed, which makes me think a bit of Lechik or even Kalila. So that's not a bad thing, and that's what makes this Spey Fumare quite attractive for me. It's quite peaty indeed. I get some ginger, a bit of pepper, but it's rather delicate. It's very easygoing, but the smoke development is very clear now, making this a lovely peaty whiskey. On the finish then. During the rather long finish, some nutmeg enters, and then the peat brings out all it can to linger as long as possible. I even get a bit of a medicinal note at the death, and at the very end there is this uprising of salt. Well, I'm not much of a fan of the Spey whiskey, as I said, but this one, who'da thunk? This is actually quite nice. This is a lovely, gently peated Speyside whiskey. Wow, Not bad. And only 18,000 bottles, and I think you can buy it for less than 50 euros. In my opinion, that's bang for your buck. And that's all for this Whiskey Rambling, and I hope to see you at one of Mark's Whiskey Ramblings real soon. And until then, may the malt be with you. Bye-bye.